I want to start at the beginning because if I don't, none of the rest of it makes any sense. I need you to understand who Mark Callahan was before I can tell you who I thought he'd become, because the confusion, the gut-wrenching, sleep-stealing confusion of those 3 months wasn't just about the locked phone and the midnight drives. It was about the impossible contradiction between the man I had known for 11 years and the stranger who had quietly moved into his body. And to understand that contradiction, you have to understand the love first. I grew up in Westerville, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus so quiet and so ordinary that the most exciting thing that ever happened on my street was when the Pattersons got a trampoline in their backyard in 2007. I was the girl who read too many books, who pressed wildflowers between dictionary pages, who believed, in that soft, stubborn way some girls do, that real love was the kind that snuck up on you gently, not a lightning bolt, not a movie moment, just a slow, steady warmth, like sunlight coming in through a kitchen window on a Saturday morning. I met Mark at Ohio State. He was studying civil engineering. I was in education. He sat 3 rows behind me in a shared humanities elective, a class called The American Experience, that neither of us particularly wanted to take. And for the first 4 weeks, I only knew him as the guy who always had the right answer, but never raised his hand with any urgency, like he already knew the world would eventually get around to asking him. He introduced himself after class on a Thursday in October, right outside Haggerty Hall, when the maple trees along the south oval had turned that impossible shade of burnt orange. He said, "I'm Mark. I think you left this." And he held out a mechanical pencil that I had absolutely left on purpose because I liked the way he fiddled with pens during lecture and thought he might return it. I know. Even at 20 years old, I was already a lot. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. 3 years of late-night drives down I-270, of Buckeye football Saturdays in the student section, of arguing about pineapple on pizza at Borgata's on High Street, of him picking me up from student teaching looking like I'd survived a war and saying, "You're the only person I know who makes exhaustion look like dedication." 3 years of learning every corner of each other. He proposed in Central Park. We'd gone to New York for my birthday, and I thought the whole trip was just a gift. A long weekend, a Broadway show, a horse-drawn carriage that I felt both enchanted by and mildly guilty about. We were walking near the Bow Bridge on a Sunday morning in early March, the kind of cold that turns your nose pink and makes the whole city look like a snow globe. And he stopped in the middle of the path and turned to face me. No bending of the knee at first. He just looked at me for a long moment, the way people look at something they've been quietly grateful for every single day. And he said, "I've been trying to figure out the right words for 2 years, Sarah. I don't think they exist. All I know is that every good thing in my life looks better because you're in it." Then he went down on one knee. And the ring, it wasn't a massive diamond. It was a vintage Art Deco setting, white gold with a small round stone, the kind that looked like it had a story. He'd found it at an estate sale in Lancaster, Ohio. He knew I loved things with history. He knew I would rather have something once loved than something brand new. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married in September, 2 years later, in a small ceremony at a renovated barn in Granville, Ohio. 40 people, string lights. My father walked me down a gravel path lined with wildflower arrangements, and he cried so hard he couldn't get through his father of the bride toast. My dad, a big, broad-shouldered man who'd spent 30 years as a high school band director and had the emotional stoicism of someone who'd seen too many teenagers cry over scales, wept like a child. Mark just stood at the end of that path and watched me come toward him, and his expression was the simplest, clearest thing I'd ever seen on a human face. He was happy. He was home. We moved into a 2-bedroom colonial on Fieldstone Drive in Dublin, Ohio, 20 minutes northwest of Columbus, a neighborhood with sidewalks and mature oak trees and neighbors who still waved from their driveways. Mark took a position with a civil engineering firm downtown. I taught fourth grade at Glacier Ridge Elementary. We argued about whose turn it was to clean the bathroom. We fell asleep on the couch watching fixer-upper reruns on HGTV. We made big plans on Sunday mornings over coffee, spreading real estate listings across the kitchen table like a map of a future we were still building together. And every single morning, every single one for 7 years of marriage, I came downstairs to find a sticky note on the coffee maker. Sometimes it was something practical, picked up dry cleaning, half and half in the fridge. Sometimes it was something silly. You're gonna crush that parent-teacher conference today. You always do. P.S. I ate the last of the Oreos and I regret nothing. Sometimes it was something that made me stand in my kitchen in my robe top and feel the full, enormous weight of being truly quietly loved. One morning, about 2 years after we got married, I was going through something hard. A miscarriage, our first and only pregnancy, early enough that we hadn't told anyone, but real enough to feel like a door closing. I came downstairs hollow-eyed, the grief still raw and formless, and I almost didn't look at the note. But there it was, in his angular engineer's handwriting. You don't have to be okay today. I'll be okay enough for both of us. I love you more than I have words for. See you tonight, M. I kept that note in the small wooden box on my nightstand, where I keep things I never want to lose. That was the man I was married to. That was Mark Callahan. Which is why, when things started to change, my world didn't just crack, it shattered. Looking back, I can identify the exact week it started, though I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time. It was the second week of February, a Tuesday. I remember because I was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner grading reading comprehension quizzes, and Mark was doing the dishes. He always did the dishes. Something about the repetition helped him decompress from the workday. And his phone buzzed on the counter. He dried his hands quickly, too quickly. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and instead of just reading the message the way he always did, he turned slightly away from me before he opened it. It was such a small thing, the slightest rotation of his shoulders. I didn't say anything. I went back to my grading. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But the next night, he took his phone off the charger on the nightstand, where it had lived every night for 7 years, and plugged it in on his side of the bed instead. And when I woke up at 2 a.m. to get a glass of water and I saw its screen light up with a notification, I watched him quickly press it face down into the mattress. He was asleep. He did it instinctively in his sleep. That small, unconscious gesture lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. March came in cold and gray, the way Ohio March always does, relentless and cheerless, and with it came the calls. The first time, I was in the living room reading when I heard him step out through the door to the garage. I assumed he was getting something from the storage shelves, but 10 minutes passed, then 15. I walked to the door and cracked it open, and he was standing next to his Chevy Silverado in the cold garage, his phone pressed to his ear, voice low and deliberate, his free hand moving the way it does when he's focused on solving a problem. I need the full set, he was saying. The brass inlays, yes, the vintage ones. I know it's expensive, that's fine. I let the door click shut quietly. I went back to the couch, I picked up my book, and stared at the same page for 20 minutes without reading a single word. The brass inlays, the vintage ones. What did that mean? What was he buying? For whom? I told myself there were 100 explanations. A project at work, a gift for someone's birthday, something for the house. Mark was not an extravagant man by nature, but he was generous, and he often surprised people with thoughtful, specific gifts. A rare book for a friend's retirement, a custom-engraved knife set for his brother's wedding. It could be anything, but I couldn't ask, because something in the careful quiet of his voice, the way he'd waited until he thought I was settled and distracted, told me he didn't want me to know. And that was new. In 11 years, that was entirely new. The late-night drives started in mid-March. The first time, I woke up at 11:15 p.m. to an empty bed. My heart rate spiked immediately, that kind of alertness that comes when your subconscious knows something is wrong before your brain catches up. I padded down the hall, checked the bathroom, came downstairs. The lights were off. His truck was gone. He came home at 12:45 a.m. I was sitting on the couch in the dark with a cup of chamomile tea I'd made more for something to hold than something to drink. He came through the front door and startled when he saw me.
"Hey," he said. "I couldn't sleep. I took a drive."
"A drive?" I said.
"Yeah, just to clear my head. You know how I get." I did know how he got. Mark processed things by moving. When he was working through a problem, he paced. When he was stressed, he drove. This was not new behavior. But the driving had never been secret before. He'd never slipped out without leaving a note. He'd never come home just before 1 a.m. smelling like... I leaned slightly toward him when he bent to kiss my cheek, like cold air, like wood shavings, like the inside of a hardware store. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Everything's great," he said, and smiled, and went to get a glass of water. "Come to bed. It's late." I sat on the couch alone for another few minutes after he went upstairs. Wood shavings. The receipt was the thing that broke me open. I found it on a Saturday afternoon in early April. I was cleaning out his truck, not snooping, genuinely cleaning because he'd borrowed it to haul mulch the weekend before, and there was dirt everywhere. And I found a crumpled Home Depot receipt in the door pocket. I smoothed it out automatically, the way you do when you're tidying up. It wasn't Home Depot merchandise. It was a printout from an online order from a specialty woodworking and hardware called Rockler Woodworking and Hardware. The items listed were dense with technical language I didn't understand. Piano hammer reshaping tool, Jacobin shellac finish, hide glue, vintage brass key slip hardware, match set. The total at the bottom was $847.63. $847. We were saving for a down payment. We had a shared Google Sheet where we tracked every purchase over $50. We'd had gentle arguments about whether we really needed the KitchenAid stand mixer last Christmas. We did not spend $847 on anything without talking about it first. I stood in the driveway in the April wind, holding that receipt, and felt the ground tilt slightly beneath me. Piano hardware. My mind wouldn't let me go there, to the place where that made sense, because the only context I had for the word piano was grief. My father had died 14 months ago, pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless. He was 63 years old. He spent his whole life making music, and in 4 months, the music stopped. In the aftermath of losing him, I had numbly arranged for his most prized possession, a 1924 Steinway Model M grand piano, slightly water damaged from a basement flood years earlier, its finish cracked and lacquer yellowing, to be moved into a climate-controlled storage unit on the west side of Columbus because I couldn't bring myself to sell it and couldn't fit it in our house and couldn't look at it yet without falling apart. I'd mentioned it to Mark exactly once, in the raw, exhausted aftermath of the funeral, when we were lying in bed at midnight and I was staring at the ceiling. I'd said, "I keep thinking about Dad's piano sitting in that storage unit, just rotting. He loved that piano more than almost anything. He would hate that." Mark had held my hand and said, "We'll figure out what to do with it." And then we'd never talked about it again. I put the receipt back in the door pocket. I went back inside. I started making dinner. And the question that had been a whisper in the back of my mind for 6 weeks became, in that moment, a roar. Who is my husband? Here is the thing about a mind that loves deeply and fears loss. It becomes a very efficient machine for producing worst-case scenarios. I am not a jealous person by nature. I want to say that clearly. In 11 years with Mark, I had never once searched his phone, had never demanded to know where he was, had never cultivated the low, simmering suspicion that some couples carry around like a chronic illness. I had trusted him the way you trust solid ground, not because I thought about it, but because it had never given me reason not to. But something about the combination of things, the turned phone, the hushed garage calls, the midnight drives, the secret purchases, started doing something to my brain that I wasn't proud of. It started building a story. By April, I had become someone I barely recognized. I started noticing things I had never noticed before, the way he sometimes looked at his phone and then set it down with a small, private smile. I had always loved that smile. Now it made my stomach turn over. I started cataloging his absences. He stayed at work late on a Wednesday. Was it really work? He said he was getting gas and was gone for 40 minutes. Where exactly? I would lie awake at 3 a.m. running calculations, constructing timelines, looking for inconsistencies, and then hating myself for looking. I talked to my friend Deb about it. Deb Kowalski, who I've known since 7th grade and who teaches 3rd grade in the room next to mine and who has the most level head of any person I've ever met. I didn't tell her everything. I told her that Mark had been distracted and secretive, and that there had been some unusual purchases and that he was taking late drives. I tried to make it sound mild. She looked at me across the table at the Stouff's coffee room on North High Street and said, "Sarah, when did you last just talk to him? Not investigate him, just talk to him." And the honest answer was, I didn't know. Because somewhere in those weeks of quiet watchfulness, I had also stopped being fully present. I was so busy studying him from the outside that I had stopped being with him. Dinner conversations had developed a slight formality, a careful pleasantness, like two polite strangers sharing a meal at a bed and breakfast. He seemed to notice it too, but didn't push. He just kept bringing me coffee in the morning and leaving his notes on the coffee maker and passing me on the stairs with a kiss that felt exactly the way it always had. That was the maddening thing. He hadn't grown distant, he hadn't become cold. He was still entirely there, still funny, still affectionate, still the man who rubbed my shoulders without being asked while I sat at the kitchen table and graded papers. The love hadn't changed, the presence hadn't changed, only the corners were hidden.
And the human brain, I have learned, cannot tolerate a mystery where it loves most. I drove past his office building one evening. I am not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not proud of it. I told myself I was running an errand on that side of town, but the truth is I wanted to see if his truck was in the parking lot when he said he was working late. It was. He was telling the truth. That should have comforted me. It did and it didn't. Because by then, I wasn't just afraid that he was lying about his location. I was afraid of something deeper and less nameable. I was afraid that there was an entire landscape inside my husband that I had somehow never seen, and that whatever was in that landscape was growing large enough to cast shadows on everything else. I started sleeping badly. I'd wake at 2 a.m. and lie there listening to him breathe and feeling a loneliness so acute it was almost physical. The loneliness of lying next to someone you love and not knowing if you truly know them. I'd reach for his hand under the blanket sometimes, just for the anchor of it, and he'd squeeze back in his sleep without waking, automatic and gentle, and that would make the loneliness worse somehow, because the hand still felt like his. Everything still felt like his. I thought about my father's piano a lot during those weeks. I'm not sure I can explain why. Maybe because it was the image I kept circling back to, something precious, something damaged, sitting in the dark in a storage unit, waiting. Maybe because it felt in some sideways way like a metaphor for what I was afraid was happening to my marriage. I missed my dad with an intensity that grief sometimes suspends and then suddenly floods back with. He would have known what to say. He always had this gift for taking the enormous, tangled thing you were feeling and locating the single thread you needed to pull. He would have sat me down at the old upright piano in his study, not the grand, the everyday one, and played something quiet while he talked to me, the way he always did when he was helping me think through something hard. He would have said, "Sweetheart, before you write the story, make sure you've read the book." I should have listened to the memory of him sooner.
But first, I had to follow my husband into the rain. It was the second Thursday in April. I had gone to bed early, or pretended to. I lay in the dark and watched the ceiling and listened. Mark was downstairs. I could hear the low murmur of the television, then the click of it turning off, then the particular silence of a house in which someone is moving carefully. At 10:52 p.m., I know because I looked at my phone, I heard the door to the garage open and close. I sat up. I waited 30 seconds, listening, and I heard the distant groan of the garage door going up, the growl of the Silverado's engine, then the garage door coming back down. I was out of bed before I'd made a conscious decision. I pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt over my pajama top. I shoved my feet into the running shoes I keep by the bedroom door. I grabbed my keys from the hook at the top of the stairs and went down and out the front door into the April night. The rain had started earlier that evening, a thin, cold, persistent rain, the kind Ohio produces in April that is never quite dramatic enough to be a proper storm, but is thoroughly miserable regardless. I was in my Subaru Outback and pulling out of the driveway in under 2 minutes. I caught his taillights on Emerald Parkway. I kept 3 cars back, the way you see people do in movies, and it felt both absurd and deadly serious at the same time. I had never followed my husband anywhere. I had never believed in 11 years that I would ever need to. And yet, here I was, driving through a cold April rain in my pajama top, heart slamming against my sternum, following the red glow of a Chevy Silverado down a road I'd driven 1,000 times like it was suddenly unfamiliar territory. He didn't take the highway. He went south on Sawmill Road, then east toward the older industrial corridor that runs along the rail lines on the western outskirts of Columbus, a neighborhood that has been slowly gentrifying for years, full of old warehouse buildings and converted factory spaces and auto body shops, and the occasional craft brewery that opened and closed and opened again. I knew this part of the city slightly. Mark had done some engineering work in this corridor 3 years ago, some survey work for a rezoning project. The rain thickened as I drove. My wipers pushed it back and forth rhythmically. I kept telling myself I could turn around. I kept telling myself that whatever I was about to find out, I could not unfind out. I kept driving. He turned onto a narrow side street, the kind with no sidewalks and sodium vapor streetlights that cast everything in an orange-gray half-light. He pulled into a small gravel lot beside a long, low industrial building, brick, maybe from the 1940s, the kind with those tall factory windows along one side, most of them dark. One window near the far end glowed faintly. I parked on the street half a block back and turned off my lights. I watched him get out of the truck. He had a paper bag from Kroger under one arm. He walked to a side entrance of the building, a heavy metal door, and keyed in a code beside it. The door opened, and he went in, and it swung shut behind him. I sat in my car for a full 2 minutes. My hands were shaking. Not dramatically, just that fine, fine trembling that happens when your nervous system doesn't know what category to file an experience under. I thought about driving home. I thought about calling Deb. I thought about sitting in that car until morning, if that's what it took, because some part of me still desperately did not want to know. But a larger part of me knew that I had already crossed too many sleepless nights to go back to not knowing. I got out of the car. The rain was cold on my face and shoulders. My sneakers crunched on wet gravel as I crossed the small parking lot. I reached the side of the building and pressed myself instinctively against the brick, which was cold and damp and slightly gritty under my palms. I worked my way along the wall toward the lit window. It was a tall industrial window, the kind with the grid of small square panes, old glass, slightly wavy, the kind that distorts things slightly when you look through it. It was set about 4 feet off the ground. I had to rise up on my toes to see through it, and I had to wipe a clear spot in the grime with the sleeve of my sweatshirt. I looked inside, and what I saw, I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The interior of the building had been partially cleared and set up as a workshop, not a professional shop, not the kind with gleaming equipment and perfect organization, but a working, earnest human workshop. the kind that tells you someone has been spending real hours here, building something with their hands and their heart. There were workbenches along one wall covered with tools, real tools, wood planes and chisels, and small hammers and bottles of something I would later learn was hide glue, the old-fashioned kind that holds antique furniture together. There were power tools, too, a belt sander, a small table saw, a drill press, items I had never seen Mark own, which meant he bought them or rented them or acquired them piece by piece for precisely this purpose. The air, even seen from outside through a wet window, had a quality that I would only understand later when I finally stepped inside. It smelled of sawdust and shellac and linseed oil, a warm, ancient workshop smell that was somehow both sharp and comforting. And in the center of the workshop, lit from above by 2 shop lights on adjustable arms, gleaming and enormous and transformed, was my father's piano. I almost didn't recognize it. The last time I had seen that piano, it was dulled with age, its finish cracked and peeling in long strips, one of its legs repaired with a crude brace after the flood that had damaged it years before the flood that really hurt it. The keys were yellowed, the brass fittings that decorated the key slip, the front panel just above the keys, had been missing 2 pieces since I was a child. I remembered pressing my finger into those empty brackets as a little girl and wondering what had originally filled them. Now the piano's surface was the color of deep autumn honey. He had stripped the old finish and reapplied it, layer by patient layer, buffed to a warmth that I could feel even through cold glass. The cracked veneer had been repaired, painstakingly, invisibly, along the grain lines. The repaired leg had been properly restored to its original form, and the brass fittings along the key slip glittered, newly set, complete. Even from outside, through old wavy glass and the blur of rain, I could see that this piano was no longer broken. It was restored. It was, somehow, more beautiful than I imagined it had ever been. And there was Mark. He was standing at the piano's side panel with a soft cloth, working in small circles, his back partially to me. He was in his old jeans, the ones with the frayed knee and the paint stain from when we redid the kitchen 2 summers ago, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had his reading glasses on, the pair he wears when he's doing close, careful work. His phone was on the bench beside him, open to what looked like a photograph he was using as a reference. He worked without hurrying. There was a quietness to him that I hadn't seen in months. Not the careful, contained quietness of a man managing a secret, but the open, absorbed quiet of a person doing something they have given themselves entirely to. He looked like himself. He looked like the version of himself that I had first loved, the one who gave his full concentration to a thing, the way a beam of light is focused through a lens. After a moment, he set down the cloth and walked around to the keys. He sat down on the small bench he had placed there, not the piano's original bench, just a simple wooden shop stool, and he lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys for a moment. Then slowly he pressed down a single note. I could not hear it through the glass in the rain, but I watched his expression as the note sounded. I watched him close his eyes briefly, then open them, and I watched something that might have been grief or might have been love or some combination of the two that doesn't have a name. I watched it move across his face like weather. And I understood, standing there in the cold rain with wet hair plastered to my face and tears running down my cheeks that I hadn't even noticed starting, that my husband had been spending his nights in this warehouse teaching himself the ancient art of piano restoration so that he could give me back my father. Not a memory of my father, not a photograph or a recording or a piece of sheet music tucked in the card, my father's piano. Whole and warm and singing again. I slid down the wall of that building until I was sitting on the wet gravel in the rain, and I pressed my hands over my mouth, and I cried like I hadn't cried since the morning of my father's funeral. Not the tight, controlled crying of a woman trying to keep it together, the other kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below language, below thought, from the deepest chamber of the self, where loss and love are stored together because they've always been the same thing. I cried for my father. I cried for the months I had spent afraid of my husband's goodness without being able to recognize it. I cried for every sleepless night I'd spent building a story about him that was wrong in every possible direction. I cried for the receipt I'd found and spent weeks interpreting as evidence of betrayal when it was actually evidence of love expressed in the most extravagant, patient, specific way I had ever witnessed. $847, not for another woman, for a matched set of vintage brass inlays, for my father's piano. Eventually, I stood up. I was soaked. My jeans were wet through, my sneakers were soaked, my sweatshirt was plastered against my back. I looked, objectively, like a woman who had been sitting in the rain crying for an indeterminate amount of time, which is precisely what I was. I walked to the metal door. I knocked. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps, then the door opened, and Mark was there, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw me was one of the most complex things I have ever witnessed. A flash of shock, then a flash of something that looked almost like fear, and then, very slowly, the beginning of understanding. We looked at each other in the open door with the rain coming down behind me and the warm woodshop smell drifting out around him. "Mark," his voice was careful, "how long have you been—" "Long enough," I said. My voice was not steady. He looked at me for a moment, and then he stepped back and held the door open, and I walked inside. The smell of the workshop was even more striking from inside. That combination of sawdust and shellac and old wood and effort. The smell of months of secret labor. The shop lights were bright and warm after the wet dark outside. I stood just inside the door and looked at the piano, and up close, it was even more stunning. I could see the detail work, the tiny careful repairs in the veneer, the way he'd matched the grain, the new finish applied in the precise number of coats needed to achieve that depth of color. On the workbench nearest me, I could see a yellow legal pad covered in Mark's handwriting, notes and diagrams with words I recognized from the receipt, hide glue, shellac, hammer voicing, and words I didn't, all in the careful engineer's shorthand he uses when he's teaching himself something new. Beside it was a stack of library books, piano servicing, tuning, and rebuilding, the piano, an encyclopedia, antique furniture restoration techniques. He checked them out from the Columbus Metropolitan Library. I could see the due date slips tucked in the covers. Mark stood a few feet away, watching me take it all in. He had taken his reading glasses off and was holding them in one hand, and he had the look of a man who has been carrying a very large, very precious thing for a very long time and is only now setting it down. "Our anniversary is 6 weeks," he said quietly. I couldn't speak. "I know we said we were saving for the house. I know this wasn't—" He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I've been trying to figure out the right way to explain the spending without spoiling it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I scared you." "You knew I was scared," I said. "I suspected, about 2 months in." He looked at the piano instead of me for a moment, and I hated it. I hated that I was causing you worry. I almost just told you. A dozen times I almost just told you. He looked back at me. "But you told me about the piano when you were greening, and you said he would hate that it was just rotting away. And I thought, I wanted to give you something real, Sarah, something you could sit down at and play and feel like he wasn't entirely gone." The last of my composure disintegrated. I crossed the workshop floor and I put my arms around my husband and I held on, in the way that you hold on to someone when you realize, with the full force of clarity, how close you came to losing your faith in them. He wrapped his arms around me immediately, and I could feel him exhale,
a long, slow release, the kind that comes at the end of holding a breath for months. We stood in the middle of that workshop in an old brick building on the edge of Columbus, Ohio, with rain ticking against the tall factory windows and the smell of sawdust and shellac all around us, and we held each other, and neither of us spoke for a long time. "I found a receipt," I finally said, into his shoulder.
He laughed, a small, slightly broken laugh. "The Rockler order. I was afraid of that." "I put it back," I said. "I put it back and I tried to pretend I hadn't seen it." "I know, I checked." He pulled back slightly to look at me, and his expression was soft and slightly rueful. "I could tell you'd found something by the way you were at dinner that night. You were too careful. You're never careful with me." "I've been a mess," I said. "You've been in love with someone who was acting secretive," he said plainly. "That's not a character flaw, Sarah. That's just what love does." I looked up at him, and then I looked past him at the piano. "Can I?" I asked. He stepped aside. I walked to the piano slowly, the way you approach something sacred. I ran my hand along the side of the case. The newly refinished wood was satiny under my palm, warm from the shop lights. I found the bench and sat down, and I lifted the fallboard, and I looked at the keys. The ivory on the naturals was original. He'd cleaned and polished each key but not replaced them, preserving that slight age and warmth. The ebony sharps gleamed. I placed my hands on the keys the way my father had taught me, the way he'd spent Sunday afternoons teaching me when I was 9 years old. I am not a particularly accomplished pianist. I took lessons until I was 12 and then quit because of soccer, which my father always said was a decision he forgave, but never fully understood. But I remembered this, the opening bars of Clair de Lune, which my father played every single evening after dinner for 30 years, which I had learned badly and incompletely from watching his hands. I played it, slowly, imperfectly, missing a note in the second phrase, pausing to correct myself. The sound that came out of that piano was unlike anything I expected. Clear, round, and warm and resonant, the sound, I would later understand, of a properly restored vintage Steinway that someone had spent 5 months learning to bring back to life. It filled the workshop and went into the high ceiling and came back down changed, softened, the way music does in old brick rooms. I played the opening of Clair de Lune in a woodworking shop in a rainstorm, and I felt my father in the room. Not literally. I'm not going to tell you it was supernatural, but there is a way that the people we've loved and lost live on in the objects they loved, in the songs they played, in the muscle memory of the children they taught. And in that moment, in that room, I felt the full, undiminished presence of who my father was, not the grief of his absence, but the fact of his having existed, the joy of it, the 30 years of evening music, the hand on my shoulder as he corrected my fingering, the way he'd play the same difficult passage 20 times without frustration, with only patient curiosity until he had it. I played until my hands stilled of their own accord. Mark was sitting on a wooden stool nearby, elbows on his knees, watching me, not saying anything, just being there, the way he has always been there.
"How?" I asked. "How did you even learn to do this?" "YouTube," he said, "and 4 library books, and a lot of failed attempts." He nodded toward a corner of the workshop where I could see, now that I was looking, what appeared to be a pile of discarded wood pieces and a disassembled practice mechanism, not from my father's piano, but from a junker upright he'd apparently found somewhere and used to practice on first. I ruined a lot of scrap material before I trusted myself with the real thing. I looked at the pile of ruined practice work, months of patient failure in the service of eventual success. "The calls," I said. "A restorer in Pittsburgh," he said, "a specialist in vintage Steinway parts. He has a warehouse full of original hardware. He was tracking down the specific brass inlay pattern for the 1924 Model M. They're not easy to find. We had about a dozen conversations." "The late drives." "Coming here. I'd wait until you were asleep so you wouldn't ask questions. I'd work for 2 or 3 hours and then come home." He paused. I know it must have felt Terrifying, I said. It felt terrifying. I'm sorry, he said again, and I knew he meant it in the deepest way. I genuinely didn't think about how it looked. I was so focused on... I just wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted to give you something that I couldn't buy. I knew you were still grieving, Sarah. I knew you didn't let yourself talk about it, and I didn't know how to crack that open except to do something with my hands. He looked at the piano. I thought if I could give you his piano bag, if I could give you something you could sit down at and feel close to him, then maybe the grief would have a place to go that wasn't just silence. I sat on the bench of my father's restored piano in the middle of a rainy April night, and I looked at the man I had almost, in my fear and confusion and love, misjudged in the worst possible way. You left me a note this morning, I said. I leave you a note every morning, he said. This morning said, almost ready, I think you're going to love it. I had read it at 6:30 a.m. over my first cup of coffee and had not known what to make of it. I thought maybe it was about the garden. He smiled, that quiet, unhurried smile I had loved since the South Oval in October, since the maple trees and the mechanical pencil I had left on purpose. It was not about the garden. No, I said, it was not. Our anniversary was on a Saturday in late May. Mark arranged to have the piano moved from the workshop to the home of my mother, the house I grew up in, where my father's music had always lived, where his music had always been, where it belonged. He hired a professional mover, a man who specializes in vintage instruments, who treated that Steinway like it was made of something more precious than wood and wire and felt. My mother, who had known what Mark was doing for the last 2 months and had somehow managed not to tell me, which, if you knew my mother, represents a feat of extraordinary willpower, stood in the doorway of her living room and covered her mouth with both hands when the movers brought it in. When they set it down in the corner by the window in the afternoon light, it was so beautiful that no one said anything for a full minute. My mother finally walked over and pressed a single key. The note rang out, clear and warm and perfect. It sounds like him, she said very quietly. It sounds exactly like him. I have thought a lot in the months since that rainy April night about what I nearly allowed fear to do to something irreplaceable, about how close I came to letting the gap between what I could see and what I couldn't see grow wide enough to become a wall, about how love sometimes moves in secret because it is growing something that isn't ready to be looked at yet, the way seeds work underground in the dark before they push into the light. I think about what I told my 4th graders once when we were reading a story about a character who judged something too quickly. I told them, the full picture is usually bigger than the piece of it you can see from where you're standing. Move around, look from more than one angle, be patient with the parts that don't make sense yet. I should have taken my own advice 2 months sooner. But here is what I also know. The love was never wrong. My instinct all those sleepless nights that the man beside me was still entirely the man I had married, that was right. The love in his face when I came down to the coffee maker every morning and found his note, that was real. The hand that found mine in the dark and held it without waking up, that was true. Sometimes the thing we're afraid of is just love wearing a disguise because it's trying to surprise us. My father's piano sits in my mother's living room now, and every Sunday when we go for dinner, I sit down and play the opening of Clair de Lune. Better than I used to because I have been practicing, because it turns out the piano teaches you patience the same way grief does, the same way love does, if you're willing to sit with the difficult passages long enough to learn them. Mark sits on the couch and watches me play with the same expression he wore in the workshop that night, the same expression he had at the end of a gravel path lined with wildflowers on a September afternoon 11 years ago. Content, unhurried, home. And I understand now, in a way I couldn't before that rainy night, that this is what love does when it is very large and very real. It works in the dark. It learns new skills. It tracks down hard-to-find things.
It drives across town after midnight and works with its hands until something broken becomes whole again. It leaves a note on the coffee maker every single morning. Almost ready? I think you're going to love it. He was right. I do. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone you love. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary things are happening in the rooms we haven't looked into yet.